At 2115 hours on July 24, E-10 Jobai Sushasan, Flight Sergeant Arthur Pendleton knelt on the cold, vibrating aluminum floorboards. He was wedged tightly inside the cramped aft fuselage of an Avro Lancaster at RAF Grimsby in the European theatre. The sharp smell of high-octane aviation fuel and leaking hydraulic fluid hung heavy in the damp English night air. Pendleton wiped thick black grease from his hands using a frayed rag. He reached for a heavy, unauthorized canvas sack tucked deliberately behind the bomber's main structural spar. He pulled a brass flashlight from his coveralls. He clicked it on, shielding the beam with his palm. He checked his mechanical wristwatch. The second hand swept past the 12. Time was running out. Flight Lieutenant James Harris sat in the pilot's seat 50 feet forward. Harris was 23 years old. He had 14 heavy night missions logged in his flight book. He had 0 confirmed night fighter kills. Over 200 German radar-guided Messerschmitt interceptors waited in the dark across the channel. They were hunting this specific Avro Lancaster B Mark III. The bomber was currently idling on the tarmac. It was preparing to fly straight into the heaviest, most sophisticated air defenses in the world. The Lancaster was a marvel of wartime engineering. It boasted 4 supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, each producing 460 horsepower. It could carry a massive 14,000-pound payload across the continent. It featured heavy defensive armor plating and 8 Browning, 303 caliber machine guns. But it had one fatal problem. It was completely visible. In the invisible electromagnetic spectrum, the massive bomber was a giant flying mirror. Bomber Command doctrine dictated strict, rigid aviation tactics. Never fly steady over the primary target. Use violent 500-foot corkscrew maneuvers to break the master searchlight beams. Don't linger in the concentrated flak zones for more than 40 seconds. Harris had tried that doctrine 14 times. It hadn't worked. The blue master searchlights always found them. The flak always tracked their exact altitude. Bomber Command lost 167 heavy aircraft in the Ruhr Valley offensive alone. The losses peaked severely between March and June. That was over 1,000 highly trained men gone in a matter of weeks. 7-man bomber crews simply vanished into the black skies over Germany. They left nothing behind but empty bunks in the freezing Nissen huts. They left unwritten letters home resting on top of their footlockers. The official debriefs at headquarters offered no tactical comfort. Command simply logged the missing aircraft and dead crews as within spec for acceptable wartime operational attrition. When surviving pilots returned with their aircraft riddled with shrapnel and reported impossible radar tracking accuracy, the brass dismissed it. They uniformly blamed pilot error. They claimed the crews simply failed to execute the evasive corkscrew maneuvers properly. The reality killing them was a precise physical system anchored on the German coast. The Würzburg radar network was ruthless and mathematically perfect. It transmitted concentrated radio waves at exactly 53 centimeters in length. These waves bounced directly off the Lancaster's expansive metal skin. The return signal provided the bomber's exact altitude, speed, and heading with a margin of error of less than 30 meters. It fed this tracking data directly to the 88mm heavy flak batteries below. The anti-aircraft guns didn't need to visually see the bombers. They just followed the invisible 5-3 centimeter tether straight to the target. Frontline crews begged for a mechanical countermeasure. The Air Ministry initially refused all requests. The heavy brass insisted the bomber's standard electronic equipment was entirely within specifications. They argued the current payloads and airframes met all standard factory tolerances. Any unauthorized tampering with the fuselage or drop systems by ground crews would strictly void warranty on the electrical systems and risk an immediate court-martial. There was absolutely no authorization for field modifications. The actual research facility producing a radical new countermeasure was locked away 150 miles from the factory floors. Paralyzed by bureaucratic fear that the Germans would simply copy the technology, Pendleton decided to bypass the chain of command with a highly illegal fix. He didn't use a complex, heavy radio jammer. He used heavy black paper and thousands of strips of simple aluminum foil. He secretly sourced the material from a local commercial packaging plant in Lincoln. He spent 40 hours cutting the foil strips to exactly 5 centimeters in length. This measurement was critical. It was exactly half the German radar wavelength. He shaped them into tight, dense bundles weighing exactly 3 ounces each. He installed a crude, angled wooden ramp directly over the aircraft's rear flare chute. The covert installation took exactly 14 minutes in the dark. He added a precisely measured, heavy-duty rubber band to the chute's release door. It applied exactly 4 pounds of tension. This tension was required to snap the bundles open violently in the 200 mile-per-hour slipstream, scattering the foil instantly. Nobody noticed the wooden modification. The strict pre-flight inspectors only checked the primary bomb fuses and the brass oxygen lines. What happened in the next 45 minutes would change the European theatre forever. At exactly 2:00 hours, Flight Lieutenant James Harris gripped the yoke of his Lancaster. The heavy bomber crossed the invisible threshold of the German coastline at 20,000 feet. The night was pitch black. Below them lay the heavily defended industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley. Harris felt the familiar, terrifying vibration in the floorboards. It was the synchronized hum of 4 Merlin engines pushing massive weight. Beside him, the navigator's chronometer ticked forward. They were exactly 45 minutes into the flight. Harris knew the grim statistics of this exact airspace. The squadron's official pilot reports haunted the briefing rooms. Just weeks earlier, on April 2 10 Flying Officer Thomas Jenkins flew this identical route at 18,000 feet. Jenkins noted in his final radio transmission that his controls felt mushy during a steep evasion turn. 2 radar-guided flak shells immediately tore his right wing off. The subsequent Air Ministry Review Board blamed the loss entirely on pilot error. Then came the loss on May 23. Squadron leader David Miller crossed the coast at exactly 0215 hours. Miller reported a distinct lag in his rudder response while trying to break a master searchlight beam. A Würzburg-directed night fighter blew his tail section apart seconds later. Command dismissed the incident. They stamped his final mission file as an acceptable loss operating strictly within spec. Harris pushed those memories away. He stared at the glowing green dials on his instrument panel. The air temperature gauge read -30 degrees. He keyed the internal intercom. He gave the signal to the rear of the aircraft, 50 feet backward in the freezing fuselage. Flight Sergeant Arthur Pendleton waited by the flare chute. He heard the sharp double click over his headset. Pendleton grabbed the first 3-ounce bundle of black paper and aluminum strips. He positioned it at the top of his unauthorized wooden ramp. He checked the tension on the heavy-duty rubber band. He pushed the bundle down the chute. The freezing 200 mile-per-hour slipstream caught the package. The rubber band snapped exactly as designed. The paper tore away. 2,000 strips of precisely cut aluminum foil exploded into the dark sky. Pendleton fed another bundle into the chute exactly 3 seconds later. He repeated this motion methodically. He dropped bundle after bundle into the void. Behind the Lancaster, a massive, invisible cloud of metal began to bloom. It hung suspended in the freezing air. It drifted slowly downward. 2 miles below, inside a concrete bunker near Hamburg, German radar operators stared at their glowing cathode ray tubes. The Würzburg screens normally displayed clean, sharp blips indicating approaching enemy bombers. The operators fed these precise coordinates directly to the anti-aircraft batteries. But at 2206 hours, the screens began to act erratically. A single blip suddenly split into 3. Then it became 10. Within 60 seconds, the green circular displays were completely swamped. Thousands of massive, overlapping signals blinded the electronic eyes of the Third Reich. The screens showed an impossible ghost armada materializing out of thin air. It looked like 10,000 heavy bombers were suddenly diving directly toward the flak towers. The highly trained operators frantically adjusted their dials. They checked their vacuum tubes for electrical faults. Nothing worked. The precise 5-3 centimeter radio waves were bouncing off the drifting aluminum strips and returning massive, false echoes. Up in the Lancaster, Harris braced for the inevitable barrage of 8-8mm shells. He waited for the deafening explosions. He waited for the lethal shrapnel to tear through the thin aluminum skin. Instead, there was absolute silence. The deadly master searchlights below began waving wildly across the empty sky. They swept back and forth without locking onto a single target. The radar-directed flak batteries opened fire, but the shells detonated miles away. The German gunners were blindly shooting at clouds of falling foil. Harris held his course steady. He didn't execute a single violent corkscrew maneuver. He flew straight and level directly over the target zone. The payload dropped perfectly on target. The Lancaster banked hard and turned back toward the English Channel. Not a single piece of shrapnel had touched the aircraft. By 0430 hours, the Lancaster touched down smoothly on the damp runway at RAF Grimsby. The massive engines spooled down into silence. Pendleton climbed out of the aft hatch. His hands were numb from the extreme cold. He walked directly to the crew chief's desk in the hangar. He pulled the standard Form 700 maintenance log from his chest pocket. He smoothed the wrinkled paper on the wooden desk. He needed to document the flight without revealing the illegal modification. He picked up a pencil as the station commander suddenly walked through the hangar doors. Pendleton froze as the station commander's heavy leather boots echoed across the concrete floor. The Form 700 maintenance log lay exposed under the glaring overhead bulb. Pendleton quickly scribbled standard payload drop. No mechanical faults across the primary line. He casually draped his grease-stained rag over the remarks section. He shoved his left hand deep into his right pocket to hide the residual aluminum dust. The commander walked straight past him without a single glance. He was staring in utter disbelief at the Lancaster's pristine fuselage. The heavy bomber showed absolutely zero shrapnel holes. It was a statistical impossibility. 7 other Lancaster bombers returned to RAF Grimsby that morning. 5 had sustained heavy anti-aircraft damage to their wings and stabilizers. 2 had completely vanished over the channel. Yet Harris's aircraft, flying the exact same 20,000-foot profile, returned completely untouched. The squadron intelligence officer recorded the anomaly. He officially classified the miraculous survival as a random variation in enemy tracking. He noted it was entirely within spec for occasional radar blind spots. He refused to investigate further. Pendleton knew it wasn't a blind spot. He knew the 26.5 centimeter foil strips had blinded the Würzburg systems. He had to spread the modification immediately to save the rest of the crews. He quietly gathered 3 trusted mechanics behind Hangar 4. He explained the precise foil measurements and the required 4 pounds of rubber band tension. Over the next 48 hours, they operated a clandestine factory inside a damp, abandoned storage shed. They worked by the light of a single, shielded kerosene lamp. The illicit manufacturing required strict operational security. The mechanics cut 12,000 new strips of commercial foil by hand. Pendleton's heavy shears slipped during the frantic cutting process. The sharp steel blade sliced deeply into his left thumb. He wrapped the bleeding wound tightly with electrical tape and kept working. They packed the shiny bundles tightly into empty 303 caliber wooden ammunition crates. The heavy military crates perfectly concealed the lightweight paper bundles. Meticulous pre-flight inspectors routinely ignored sealed ammunition boxes. Under the cover of darkness, the team bolted 4 new unauthorized wooden ramps into 4 different bombers. Unit records suggest a sudden, inexplicable drop in casualty rates among Grimsby's B flight. Over the next 14 days, the 4 modified bombers flew 7 deep penetration missions into the heavily defended Ruhr Valley. The crews dropped over 400 bundles of foil into the freezing slipstreams over Germany. The results were immediate and staggering. The radar-directed flak batteries below repeatedly fired thousands of heavy 8.8mm shells into completely empty airspace. The explosions harmlessly peppered the drifting aluminum clouds. The 4 rogue Lancasters suffered a 0% loss rate during the intensive 2-week period. The rest of the unmodified squadron continued to suffer an agonizing 9% attrition rate per mission. Dozens of young men continued to die while flying perfectly functional aircraft. The tactical disparity was stark, brutal, and mathematically undeniable. Pendleton carefully managed the dangerous paper trail. Every morning, he falsified the Form 700 logs for all 4 aircraft. He forged the signatures of non-existent sub-inspectors to cover the added weight of the missing ammunition crates. The mechanics worked frantically between the 0200-hour return times and the 0600-hour daylight inspections. They swept the bomber floors meticulously. They checked every corner of the aft fuselage. A single shiny strip left near the flare chute would trigger an immediate court-martial. Across the English Channel, the German High Command noticed the localized radar failures. General Joseph Kamhuber commanded the sprawling, highly advanced night fighter network known as the Kamhuber Line. He reviewed the frantic after-action summaries pouring in from the Hamburg and Essen sectors. The reports described massive electronic ghosts blinding the critical 3-centimeter frequencies. Ground crews ran frantic diagnostic tests on their Würzburg dishes. They checked their delicate vacuum tubes and recalibrated their oscilloscopes. The false returns remained. Frustrated operators logged over 200 phantom bombers materializing simultaneously in a single grid square. Kamhuber refused to believe his impenetrable electronic wall was failing. He ordered an immediate, intensive technical investigation. He deployed 3 elite night fighter aces to the sector. He ordered them to visually intercept the Ghost fleet and report exactly what was flying through his airspace. Back at Grimsby, the stakes escalated dramatically. On August 2, Jobai Sushasan, Bomber Command ordered a maximum effort raid against heavily defended synthetic oil plants. Pendleton stood on the tarmac at 1930 hours. He was loading the final contraband crate into the aft hatch of Lancaster G for George. The 4 massive Merlin engines were already whining loudly, preparing for takeoff. Suddenly, an Air Ministry technical inspector stepped out of a black staff car. The inspector held a silver clipboard containing the official pre-flight manifest. He walked aggressively toward the aft hatch. He pointed a stiff, gloved finger directly at Pendleton's unauthorized wooden ramp. The 4 Merlin engines roared at a deafening 2,800 revolutions per minute. The Air Ministry inspector jabbed his gloved finger at the crude wooden ramp bolted over the flare chute of Lancaster G for George. Pendleton stood frozen on the vibrating tarmac at exactly 1932 hours. The silver clipboard in the inspector's hand held the official pre-flight manifest. The pristine document clearly showed 0 authorized structural modifications. Explain this installation. The inspector shouted over the mechanical thunder. Pendleton wiped his grease-stained hands. He lied. He claimed it was a standard flare deflector. He insisted it fell entirely within spec for field safety. The inspector did not blink. He demanded to see the Form 700 maintenance log. Pendleton pulled the falsified paper from his pocket. The inspector cross-referenced the log with the heavy 303 caliber ammunition crates stacked inside the fuselage. He noticed the weight discrepancy immediately. 4 crates weighed 240 pounds. The manifest listed standard flare boxes weighing only 40. The inspector climbed through the aft hatch. Pendleton followed, his heart pounding against his ribs. The inspector unlatched the nearest wooden crate. He did not find brass ammunition. He found tightly packed bundles of black paper and commercial aluminum foil. He pulled 1 3-ounce package from the box. He broke the heavy-duty rubber band. 2,000 perfectly cut 26.5 centimeter strips cascaded onto the aluminum floorboards. This is an unauthorized payload. The inspector stated bluntly, "You have voided the electrical warranty. I am grounding this aircraft." Flight Lieutenant Harris climbed down from the cockpit. He squeezed past the navigator's station and faced the inspector in the cramped tail section. Harris did not argue regulations. He used hard numbers. He pointed to the scattered foil. He explained the exact 5.3 centimeter wavelength of the Würzburg radar. He explained the sudden 50% reduction in radio frequency returns they had witnessed. Then Harris delivered the final, crushing statistic. A flight flew standard doctrine last night. Harris said, "They lost 3 aircraft and 21 men. B flight dropped this paper. We flew 4 aircraft. We lost 0. The inspector stared at the scattered foil. He looked down at his silver clipboard. The official attrition reports perfectly matched Harris's blunt claim. The inspector faced a brutal bureaucratic dilemma. Grounding the aircraft meant sending another crew into a mathematically certain death loop. Permitting the flight meant risking his own career on an illegal, untested field modification. The inspector slowly bent down. He picked up a single strip of aluminum. He placed it inside his heavy leather coat. He signed his name across the bottom of the Form 700 log. He authorized the launch. He ordered Pendleton to report to the station commander at 0600 hours with a full technical schematic. At 2345 hours, Lancaster G for George crossed into the airspace over Gelsenkirchen at 21,000 feet. The temperature dropped to -34 degrees. Pendleton knelt by the wooden ramp. He began feeding the 3-ounce bundles into the slipstream, exactly every 3 seconds. The radar ghosts bloomed instantly across the German defense grid. 3 miles below, Hauptmann Klaus Weber throttled his Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter up to 280 miles per hour. Weber was a veteran interceptor. He relied on the Liechtenstein airborne radar mounted on his nose. His radar operator, Lieutenant Brandt, stared at the twin oscilloscopes in the rear seat. "I have 40 heavy targets." Brandt reported over the intercom. "Distance is 2 kilometers. They are everywhere." Weber armed his twin 20mm cannons. He climbed aggressively into the dark center of the bomber stream. He expected to see massive 4-engine silhouettes blocking out the stars. He expected to trigger a lethal ambush. Instead, his aircraft violently slammed into a dense, sparkling cloud. Thousands of metallic strips whipped against his reinforced canopy glass. The aluminum shredded violently in his propellers. The engines coughed, ingesting the lightweight paper, but kept running. Weber pulled back on the stick and banked hard. There were no bombers. There were only drifting ribbons of metal reflecting the moonlight. His Liechtenstein radar screen completely washed out in a blinding green glow. The entire onboard tracking system was rendered completely useless. Post-war intelligence summaries suggest Weber immediately keyed his radio. He bypassed sector control entirely. He broadcast an emergency, uncoded transmission directly to General Kemhuber's headquarters, confirming the Ghost Fleet was a mechanical illusion. Back at RAF Grimsby, the sun began to rise. It was 0555 hours. Pendleton stood outside the station commander's office. He held a hastily drawn blueprint of the wooden ramp. He held one final bundle of foil. The heavy oak door swung open. 2 high-ranking Air Ministry intelligence officers walked out. They were flanked by the technical inspector from the night before. The inspector pointed directly at Pendleton. At exactly 0555 hours outside the station commander's office at RAF Grimsby, the technical inspector lowered his arm. He did not order the military police to arrest Pendleton. Instead, he demanded the hastily drawn blueprint and the final 3-ounce bundle of foil. The 2 Air Ministry intelligence officers stepped forward. They wore pristine blue uniforms that starkly contrasted with Pendleton's grease-stained coveralls. They took the contraband materials in silence. They stepped back into the cramped, smoke-filled office and closed the heavy oak door. Flight Lieutenant Harris stood silently beside Pendleton in the cold, damp corridor. They waited for the inevitable court-martial. Inside the office, the intelligence officers unrolled the unauthorized wooden ramp schematic. They placed the tightly bound 26.5 centimeter foil strips directly onto the commander's mahogany desk. They cross-referenced Pendleton's precise measurements with a top-secret file code named Window. The British scientific establishment had secretly discovered this exact radar exploit 18 months earlier. They knew the German Würzburg systems were fatally vulnerable to half-wavelength metal reflectors. However, the High Command had strictly paralyzed the project. They feared the Luftwaffe would simply sweep the fallen foil off the German streets. They feared the enemy would copy the precise dimensions and use it to blind the British mainland early warning radars. This strategic dilemma had forced Command to sacrifice hundreds of heavy bomber crews to protect a theoretical secret. But Pendleton's rogue field test shattered their paralyzing logic. The intelligence officers reviewed the staggering survival statistics from B flight. The 4 illegally modified Lancasters had flown 24 deep penetration sorties over a brutal 2-week period. They had dropped exactly 400 bundles of foil into the freezing slipstream. They had suffered absolutely 0 aircraft losses. During that exact same 1-4-day window, the unmodified bomber squadrons had lost 42 heavy aircraft while operating strictly within spec. The casualty ratio was far too massive to ignore. The institutional refrain of pilot error could no longer hide the tactical reality. Within 72 hours, Bomber Command Headquarters completely reversed its rigid doctrine. They issued an urgent, highly classified mandate. They ordered the immediate, mass implementation of the aluminum countermeasure across the entire European bomber fleet. They bypassed the slow military factory supply chains entirely. They requisitioned commercial packaging plants across England to rapidly cut millions of identical 26 cm strips. They officially adopted Pendleton's crude 4-pound tension release mechanism for the standard flare chutes. The Form 700 maintenance logs were quietly updated to officially authorize heavy payloads of paper. The massive scale of this new tactic was unleashed on the night of July 24. Itenjo by Sushasan. Operation Gomorrah targeted the industrial center of Hamburg. Over 790 heavy bombers crossed the German coastline at 20,000 feet. The crews systematically fed 92 million individual strips of aluminum into the dark sky. They dropped exactly 2.5 million bundles over a concentrated duration of 50 minutes. The resulting metallic cloud weighed an astonishing 40 tons. It stretched for 300 miles across the freezing upper atmosphere. The entire Kammhuber line collapsed in minutes. German radar operators frantically reported over 11,000 Phantom bombers filling their completely washed-out screens. The radar-directed 8mm flak batteries fired thousands of heavy shells blindly into the empty darkness. Hauptmann Klaus Weber and his fellow interceptors were left circling helplessly at 15,000 feet. Their onboard Liechtenstein radars were utterly useless against the blinding green static. The tactical shift was historically unprecedented. Bomber casualty rates over Hamburg plummeted from a projected 10% to an astonishing 5% overnight. Thousands of highly trained men returned to their freezing Nissen huts, who otherwise would have vanished forever. Pendleton never received a formal commendation for his insubordinate engineering. The brass buried the origin of the field expedient fix deep inside classified operational reports. He simply returned to the oil-stained tarmac at RAF Grimsby to turn wrenches on Lancaster G for George. Decades later, military historians combing through fraying Form 700 inspection sheets finally uncovered the mechanical truth. Post-war historical summaries noted the bizarre weight discrepancies and the forged signatures in the days immediately preceding the official window mandate. They realized the ultimate destruction of the most advanced electronic early warning network in the world did not begin in a high-level government laboratory. It began with an exhausted mechanic, a pair of heavy metal shears, and a few cents worth of commercial paper. If you found this breakdown of World War II tactical history compelling, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments which impossible engineering feat we should cover next.